The corridors of royal storytelling have long whispered about a letter, a scathing private note from Princess Margaret to Sarah Ferguson, one that alleged scandal, wounded pride, and a fierce defense of dynastic dignity. The letter, if it ever existed, has never been authenticated by the palace. Yet it persists in royal lore, often cited in tabloid retellings, biographies, and speculative histories. Still, even in its uncertainty, the legend of that note reveals as much about the monarchy's unspoken hierarchy as any official record. We begin with what we know. Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, married Prince Andrew in 1986. From early days, she brought vitality, charm, and a sense of humor to royal life. But her path was never entirely straightforward. Her relationship with parts of the royal family was complex, subject to scrutiny and occasional tension. In 1992, scandal erupted over tabloid photos. In later years, she lived under intense media pressure. Her attempts to build a public persona were sometimes generous, sometimes fraught with misstep. Princess Margaret, the Queen's sister, was famed for candor behind closed doors, for biting wit, and for fierce loyalty to the royal standards she believed mattered. She had lived a life constantly under public gaze, but also behind a curtain of aristocratic privacy. She knew palace politics intimately. She knew the balance between protocol and authenticity, between family and institution. The rumored letter is said to have arrived shortly after one of Ferguson's more controversial revelations, some version of which involves public disclosure of private family detail. According to repeated retellings, the letter arrived unsolicited, a gesture of rebuke. The letter allegedly chastises Ferguson for disgraceful photographs, for bringing shame, and for failing to consider the damage done to royal dignity. Some versions name specific portraits or incidents, toe-sucking photos, tabloid exposures. The tone is purportedly furious, hurt, sharp, less interpersonal quarrel than dynastic warning. Whether Margaret actually wrote those words, or whether they reflect projection by journalists, biographers, or palace commentators, is unclear. No authenticated manuscript has ever surfaced in the royal archives. No palace handler has confirmed it. In public memoirs and official histories, it is unmentioned. Yet it endures. Why? Because the legend of the letter captures a tension at the heart of monarchy, the conflict between intimacy and institution, between legacy and personality. When a royal family member deviates from accepted codes of discretion, the stroke of a pen, private unrecorded, can become more powerful than a public rebuke. The imagined Margaret letter becomes a symbol, a warning: stay in line or risk exclusion. To reconstruct what the letter might mean, we can map its symbolic weight. First, the letter reflects Margaret's role as guardian of protocol. She was not sovereign, but she had authority in symbolic memory. She stood behind the Queen, often voicing what could not be publicly stated. Her imagined rebuke is a reminder that for Ferguson to speak too freely about royal affairs is not merely personal indiscretion, it is institutional risk. Second, the tone of rebuke suggests that Ferguson is overstepping boundaries not just of decorum, but of membership. The letter frames her as belonging to the margins rather than the center. To be chastised is to be reminded of the boundary. The implied message: you are welcome as spouse, but not as insider. Third, the letter underscores the risk of narrative control. If Ferguson's memoirs or statements shape public perception, then Margaret's imagined note is a counter-narrative, a defensive assertion of what the palace believes the public should believe about reputation, dignity, and memory. We may never know if Margaret ever wrote that exact letter, but we can look at adjacent evidence. In private correspondence Margaret left in published biographies, she does not shun criticism of her royal relations. She praises loyalty, warns against indiscretion, and holds strong expectations for propriety. She once scolded other royals for revealing too much. Her voice was often protective of the royal image. In media reporting and royal journalism, the idea of the Margaret letter is repeated often as if factual, which gives it a kind of folklore strength. Biographers write around it, noting that even if no manuscript exists, the memoirists say she once sent it. The layering of retelling gives it partial authenticity in the public imagination. For Sarah Ferguson, the legend functions as a mirror. To be subject of that note is to be marked by the institution's liminal sanction. She becomes, in the popular mind, the Duchess forever walking between public persona and private reproach. The letter is not just criticism of her past, it is a signal that she must always remain cautious, never overreaching. In royal households, letters have weight. Not only what is written, but who writes them. A note from the Queen's sister carries gravitas. The imagined Margaret letter signals that no matter how popular Ferguson becomes, there are still corners of the firm she cannot enter, rooms she cannot cross. The vision of Margaret's words keeps her in place, even without an official order. The legend also hints at generational judgment. Margaret was of an era of restrained decorum, before social media, before tabloid saturation. Ferguson arrived in a later era and tested rules. The letter mythologizes that difference. It is the voice of the older guard reminding the new arrival of old constraints. If we imagine the letter's contents, we also imagine the emotional registers within the palace: wounded pride, defensive posture, fear of irrelevance. For Margaret, the risk may have seemed less reputational than existential. If Ferguson's narrative dominates public conversation, what becomes of royal memory? If a woodcut of scandal overshadows continuity, the institution may seem brittle. To narrate the letter's meaning is not to indict Ferguson or Margaret, it is to expose how monarchy negotiates family and symbolism. It is to ask, who holds authority when monarchy is both family and public office, and how do voices of dissent get contained? If a video were made today about that letter, the script would walk carefully. First, recounting Ferguson's controversies. The toe photo scandal has existed in tabloids, though factual attribution remains murky. Her memoir disclosures her public attempts to resurrect her reputation. Then the story would introduce the Margaret letter not as fact, but as a persistent legend. It would present what biographers and royal analysts say and contrast it with the lack of archival evidence. Then the script would delve into symbolic meaning. A palace whisper, a boundary mark, a warning that speaks louder because it is spoken quietly, behind closed doors. Finally, such a script would conclude by exploring the modern dimension. In an era when every royal has a platform, when memoirs circulate, when a word can go global, do letters still matter? And if not Margaret, then who now writes the unspoken rules for royals? Lacking manuscript or palace confirmation, the Margaret letter remains legend, not proof. But in legend lies power. In that ghostly note lies the architecture of royal control, the demand for discretion, and the boundary between member and outsider. What the letter tells us, real or not, is the Crown's capacity to guard itself through silence, through whispers, and through symbolic sanctions. Ferguson may never read Margaret's words, but in royal memory, the echo may already have bound her hands.